the crowd has quieted and found its way back in. So welcome to this second panel. My name is Barry Burden. I'm a professor of political science here at UW, also director of the Elections Research Center, which is one of the co-sponsors of the event. We're so glad to have you all here. And the questions I think that arose at the end of the first panel are a segue to this one. There was a lot of interest in fusion in particular, and we're going to round that corner here to transition from political science and the study of political parties and authoritarianism to thinking about fusion in particular and election law and its connection to all of those topics. So this panel is titled Fusion Voting in Context: From Wisconsin's Roots to Today's Courtrooms. We have four terrific panelists that I think are going to give you everything you want to know. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then they'll each take 5 minutes of comments. We'll have some conversation and then Q&A with the audience. So first up will be Allie Morris. Allie is a PhD student in history here at UW-Madison, actually a joint PhD student in educational policy studies and history. She's interested in gender, women, and sexuality in the late 20th century United States, and her research is focusing on the political history of girlhood in the 1960s up through the 1990s, examining girls' culture and activism in the American high school. She's going to tell us today, though, about fusion and its history in Wisconsin. Next up will be Andy Craig. Andy's a fellow in elections policy at the Rainey Center. Andy's a fellow in the Institute for Humane Studies and at the Rainey Center, as I mentioned, and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. His work is focused on election law, election reform, political incentives, reducing polarization, and improving representative government. His work has been cited by members of both major parties in the House and Senate's Rules Committee and in state legislatures across the country. He also has written for outlets including The Washington Post, The Nation, Politico, and regularly for The Daily Beast and The Unpopulist. He also has some experience in elective politics and was a campaign staffer and consultant, including for Gary Johnson's minor party 2016 presidential campaign. Next up, Derek Muller, professor of law at Notre Dame Law School. Derek is a nationally recognized scholar in the field of election law. His research focuses on the role of states in the administration of federal elections, constitutional aspects of voting rights in election administration, limits of judicial power, and the Electoral College, which came up in questions just a bit ago. He has written more than 24 academic works, many op-eds in places including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. He has testified before Congress, is a contributor, and I think sometimes host of the Election Law blog, a really valuable resource. And he's co-author of a federal courts casebook published by Carolina Academic Press. Finally, Beau Trematiere is counsel and head of the National Elections and National Security Team at Protect Democracy. Beau develops and leads advocacy projects targeting political extremism. Before he joined Protect Democracy, Beau served as a policy aide in the U.S. Senate, a litigation associate in a national law firm. He was also a law clerk in federal court and appeals court and district court. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard, law degree from Northwestern, where he was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. So an amazing lineup of voices and areas of expertise. So we're going to start with Allie.
Okay. Hello. I think it's still morning, so good morning. And thank you so much for that introduction. I'm excited to kick off this panel with a discussion on the history of fusion in Wisconsin. More specifically, I hope to define fusion in its historical context and show how fusion was a first principle of Wisconsin politics, and also explain how the fusion ban in Wisconsin was an intentional move to solidify one's party's power. So I first want to define fusion in Wisconsin history. So from Wisconsin statehood into the 1850s, we found that fusion was used as an umbrella term that encompassed many different forms of cross-party alliances. These included full-scale mergers between political parties, whether one party absorbed another or the two parties merged to form a new entity. It was also informal cooperations in support of single candidacies, as well as the form to which fusion refers to today, in which multiple political parties agreed to nominate the same candidate for the same office, and the candidate's name appeared on the ballots or in the party columns of all coalition partners. So fusion nominations provided the possibility of coalition without merger. So by understanding how 19th century Wisconsinites defined fusion and practiced fusion, which they defined as coalitions between political parties that took many different forms, we actually trace this coalitional principle all the way back to Wisconsin statehood. So in 1848, Wisconsin's Constitution was born out of a fair and representative cross-party coalition of Democrats and Whigs, but only after voters rejected an initial version produced by a convention dominated by Democratic delegates. So for the next 50 years, political parties in Wisconsin experimented with a variety of forms of cross-party coalitions. Some of these parties, the Abolition Party, the Free Soil Party, the Reform Party, the Silver Party, the Greenback Party, Temperance Party, and the Populist Party, among others, had significant electoral impact despite being short-lived. Anti-slavery third parties and major party factions in Michigan and Wisconsin gave the first Republican Party its start in a fusion movement that they were the first and only to embrace, at least initially. So the Republican Party, originated in 1854, was a product of such unions or fusions, as they were called. Though it may be contested by historians on where the Republican Party actually originated, many historians do cite Ripon, Wisconsin as the birthplace of the Republican Party. In fact, there's even a one-room schoolhouse in Ripon that has a sign that reads, "The birthplace of the Republican Party." So leaders of Wisconsin's anti-slavery third political parties played a key role in the founding of the Republican Party. And although fusion nominations were rare during the pre-Civil War period, because the established parties typically enjoyed the luxury of refusing them, the practice was present and successful in Wisconsin. Fusion nominations spread in Wisconsin and the U.S. generally, beginning in the 1870s and ending in Wisconsin but not nationwide in the late 1890s. So, for example, in 1851, Wisconsin's second ever governor, Leonard J. Farwell, was elected through a fusion nomination between the Whig and Free Soil Party. In 1873, William R. Taylor won the governorship running on a fusion nomination by the Democratic Party and the Reform Party. The Republicans regained the governorship back in 1875, but the next 2 decades were characterized by tremendous growth in fusion nominations. The Democratic Party fused at various times with a wide range of parties, including sometimes the Republican Party, and a joint effort of the 2 dominant parties to contain the growth of similar parties. So in an era generally characterized by Republican control by most historians, Wisconsin politics actually remained a hotbed of robust competition, fueled by a continuation of multi-party coalition activity that frequently took the form of fusion nominations. That is, until the Wisconsin Republicans, a party that benefited from cross-party coalition, banned fusion to achieve partisan protectionism. So in 1897, the Wisconsin legislature, where only 14 of the 133 total seats were held by non-Republicans, passed a law banning fusion nominations. The ban passed without opposition or even a floor debate. Many newspapers at the time expressed surprise that such a consequential provision would pass without fanfare. And while some may point back to the ballot reform beginning in 1887 in Wisconsin as the precedent for banning fusion, nothing about the Australian ballot foreclosed fusion voting, and indeed, fusion nominations continued to be widely used into the 1890s. So the 1897 ban has, of course, persisted since, and continues to be one of the central topic of today's panel. Thank you so much.
Up next is Andy Craig.
Hello, and thank you everyone for being here. So Ali touched a little bit on the Wisconsin history. I want to put it zoom out a little bit, the national context and history. So you know, if you're active in this space, you've probably heard of, proportional representation, ranked choice voting, all those sorts of things. Those were deliberately designed reforms. At some point, somebody sat down and came up with the idea, hey, wouldn't this be a better way to do it? That's not how fusion originated. To understand why we had this long history of fusion in the United States, you have to go back to kind of how elections were conducted in the early republic and through most of the 19th century. There was no government printed ballot, something we take for granted, that you go into the polling place and there's a uniform standard ballot and you pick your candidates. That wasn't how it worked. Early on, there were still some cases of voice voting. That was impractical. Around the era of the founding, the big reform was we're going to have paper ballots. But it was a do-it-yourself system. You could, in principle, vote with any slip of paper you wanted. Write your names on who you want to vote for. But in practice, this developed into the party ticket ballot. So that's what we still speak of today when we talk about a running mate being put on the ticket or straight ticket voters. So it was literally often in party newspapers, because the newspapers were highly partisan, they would print out this column, this coupon, your party ticket that listed all the party's nominees. And you would take that and you would use that as your ballot to vote. So in this context, it wasn't that anybody sat down and decided, yeah, we're going to allow fusion. There was no way to ban it. You couldn't if your third party group, or the anti-Masonic party, or the Free Soil party, or whatever the case may be, decided we're gonna back that guy, but not that guy. They can print up their own ballots and cast them, and it's all perfectly valid. So as Ali alluded to, towards the end of the 19th century, we got was known as the Australian ballot. This is where it was tied to having a secret ballot, was a big reform. Obviously, for election security reasons, it wasn't ideal to have these party ticket ballots. It made a lot of shenanigans easier to pull off. But in principle, this is simply an administrative thing. So that is why still today, even though the Supreme Court got a case wrong that we'll talk about with fusion, but in principle today, the state of the law is that putting a candidate on the ballot is a First Amendment right. It's free speech. And I mean, if you go back to the party ticket era, it was literally freedom of the press. It was you print out your ticket and send them to your voters, and that's all well and good. But the only valid reason to allow all these, we have petition hurdles and all this process now to get on the ballot, all these regulations is supposed to only be to avoid voter confusion. You don't want somebody spamming the ballot with dozens of candidates or, ridiculous things like that. That would be impractical. So that's the only legitimate constitutional law reason. So it was through this, as was mentioned, we got all the parties that came together that coalesced into forming the Republican Party. And I will touch on one historic incident that I think is really important. Some of you might have seen on PBS, it was a year or two ago, An American Coup, which is about the 1890s in North Carolina. And what happened in North Carolina was there was the mostly black Republicans, there was the dominant Democrats, and there was it became known as the Populist Party. It was poor white agrarians, farmers, basically. And they had an election, and 1 year, it was the first past the post system. The Democrats won, but it was with less than 50%. So the Republicans and the Populists got together, hammered out an agreement. And it was actually from this context that the term fusion, for this particular kind of fusion of two parties cross-nominating candidate, came in. So the Republicans and Populists won. They won a majority in the legislature. They won the governorship. The Democrats were not happy about this. They ran some, in my paper on the history of fusion at the Rainey Center, I quote some of this. It was very vitriolic about what this meant, because it enabled black political power in the South. And it was, in fact, this was the only time between the end of Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era where white supremacist Democrats lost control of the state government in the South. But then next election rolls around, the fusion coalition broke apart over it was monetary policy, actually, gold bugs and silver bugs. And when they came in, that was when North Carolina banned fusion. And they were very explicit. They were going to do two things when they came in, and this is in their campaign materials, the official state Democratic handbook from that year's campaign. We're going to do two things. We're going to do mass disenfranchisement, so literacy tests, poll taxes, all that stuff we're familiar with from that history, and they're going to ban fusion. And so that's what they did. And like in Wisconsin, where it was a partisan thing, it wasn't always necessarily that racial context, but the history of how fusion was banned state by state is almost always an ugly story of a political party abusing its control over the government printed ballot to enact what is fundamentally a policy of censorship. If I'm the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or the Working Families Party, we should be able to nominate any eligible candidate we want who wants to accept our nomination. And that's the principle at stake. So even though people who aren't from New York and aren't used to seeing it on their ballot, this can seem kind of an odd idea. When you really walk through that history, it's banning fusion that is the aberration. So I'm very happy to have this event, and I'm looking forward to watching the litigation move forward here in Wisconsin, as it is in several other states.
Up next is Derek Muller. Thank you. It's always great to come to Madison, and I appreciate you letting a law professor among a bunch of political scientists here today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here with so many thoughtful, pragmatic voices to weigh both the ideal and the realistic things to think about election law, election administration, and election reform. I count myself among those who are supporters of fusion, although maybe more of a skeptical supporter. Maybe I won't use the term fusion curious, but I'll share a few of my thoughts and then look forward to the dialogue. Fusion voting is, again, as we've heard, hardly a new idea, but the reform here is new for this political moment. In the late 19th century, it was common to see these smaller parties fuse with the larger ones and to nominate the same candidates for office. It allowed them to survive, to signal priorities, perhaps to extract concessions. But by the early 20th century, many of these states began to ban the practice. Legislatures may have worried about blurring party lines, about confusing voters, about making accountability harder to assign, or they might have had more nefarious motives, as we've heard about already. Of course, at the same time in this era of American politics, the Australian ballot, that is the state-printed secret ballot, was new and was now developing with a number of new regulations with respect to it. States increasingly required specific kinds of markings on the ballot in order for a voter to be able to indicate that they supported a candidate. Certain kinds of checks or X's would be acceptable and other kinds would not. They stopped listing the electors for the ballot in presidential elections. That is, you could check one box with the president and vice president's name behind it, and it was a proxy for voting for a slate of unnamed electors behind the ticket. In short, this was a form of the ticket was changing with different methods of election administration, and we began to change these methods over the years with the arrival of the Australian ballot. Now, fusion voting is to some degree, at least as we see today, somewhat back in vogue. Reformers would describe it as a modest cure for political polarization, a way to loosen the grip of two major parties without blowing up the political system. The hope is that cross-endorsements might reward candidates with broader appeal and encourage coalitions that could reach toward the center. It's an attractive proposal, but one that, again, I have some skepticism about, although also some support. The instinct, I think, is right to suggest that building broader coalitions is good, but what fusion might do, I think, is more uncertain. In theory, a centrist party could endorse a more pragmatic Democrat or a more reform-oriented Republican and give voters a signal that this candidate rises above maybe the partisan orthodoxy, and this party can reliably be counted upon to signal to voters the more moderate choices among Republicans and Democrats, and that will incentivize moderation. But in practice, fusion is value neutral. There's nothing in the structure that favors a centrist party over an outlier party. Minor parties could arise that support a MAGA candidate or for hard-right Republicans or socialist labor candidates for uncompromising progressives. Fusion doesn't necessarily create moderation. It might. It just multiplies the different models. So it's unclear what effect fusion might have in the states. On that, I'm supportive of experimentation. It seems to me we should see more real-world experiments. I'm just simply noting that the effects on voters are much less certain. What's the appetite of voters for such a system? Their stated preference might be very different than their revealed preferences. Additionally, the leadership and organization of these parties will matter greatly about what they look like in 4, 8, 12 years, and if their leadership changes their preferences over time. Obviously, the greatest legal hurdle is Timmons, a Supreme Court case in 1997. And very briefly, Timmons essentially said that the state of Minnesota could require candidates to choose essentially among which parties have endorsed them. That is, you can't be the nominee of multiple parties even if the parties support you. The party can support you publicly. They can advocate on your behalf. They can print advertisements in your behalf. They simply can't have that label on the ballot. Overturning Timmons is an uphill battle for several reasons. First, the court's appetite for these cases is very low. It has not taken a significant case on what we would describe as Anderson-Burdick balancing cases since 2008. If anything, in my judgment, the court is more likely to throw out its power to review ballot access cases like fusion voting altogether, rather than to more vigorously enforce what states are doing. Likewise, as wrong-headed as some of the justifications in Timmons might be, particularly its concern about the proliferation of parties given adequate alternative measures to tamp down on them, it seems unlikely that the court is still going to second-guess what legislatures have done. That is, it's one thing for the court to examine long-standing opportunities the legislature has taken away, but it's another thing when the legislature has not the opportunity has not existed in most states for 100 years for the court to essentially force it upon the states. For reformers, then, this is not a matter really for the federal courts. It's a matter for the state courts, as Bo will talk about, or the state legislatures, and those legislatures are controlled by the very parties fusion is designed to unsettle, or for the initiative process, which requires significant voter education and interest to achieve success. And this brings me to politics, and sort of my last point. The major parties, of course, are unlikely to sit idly by. Democrats and Republicans have strong incentives to protect their brands. They are unlikely to welcome outside groups placing their nominees on extra ballot lines, even if for ostensibly friendly reasons. If fusion returns, we might expect some countermoves, perhaps tighter nomination rules for parties, perhaps parties requiring certain kinds of loyalty pledges to get the party line of Republican or Democrat, new restrictions on new parties in the states. And that could have unanticipated consequences for existing parties like the Green or Libertarian parties in the states. So we shouldn't dismiss fusion entirely. It reflects a healthy instinct to give voters more choices and more opportunities. It offers an outlet for disaffected citizens who want to register their dissent in different ways. And it reminds us that states are still the principal places to administer elections and to experiment with them. But the thing that I want to watch in the future is that institutional tinkering can only go so far. In the end, moderation of political parties arises from the harder civic work of persuasion, restraint, and patience. If fusion parties arise to do that work, then perhaps my skepticism will be proven wrong, and we can see a renaissance of political participation through the intermediary institutions of political parties. These parties, after all, have longer-term collective interests in mind as they behave. Whether they're centrist or more ideologically pure, the institution building of engaged political bodies would be beneficial to an increasingly fragmented political culture, refining and channeling views through intermediary bodies that may be more responsive to voters. Thank you.
Bo is next. Morning, everybody. Thank you all for having me. I'm really grateful to get to be here. So I think in the introductory remarks, Barry, you said we're going to tell you everything you want to know. I want to set the bar a little lower. I want to try and tell you two things in 5 minutes. One, I want to pick up some of the threads on why my organization, Protect Democracy, views fusion as a priority reform. And then second, I'm going to pick up the thread on some of the state court litigation, why we're talking about courts and state courts in the context of something that is often described as an electoral reform. So on the first topic, just double tapping on a few of the things that were raised earlier, we really think about these problems through the lens of my organization's mission statement, which is to prevent U.S. government from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. And so we're really thinking through the lens of worst case scenarios, one of which we feel like we're living in real time. And so you have to look at the cost of the status quo. What is the system that we have right now producing? And how can we learn from our own history, political science, and theory to understand interventions that might move us in a better direction? Another thing that I want to emphasize is that there's certainly no single cause. Anyone who's telling you that is mistaken, right? And there's no single solution. Likewise, anyone who's come to say this one thing is going to fix us, wish it were that simple, but it's clearly not. And so then what can we do to make things better? How can we make informed and educated guesses about steps forward? And one of the things that seems quite clear from the scholarship, comparative and domestic, theoretical and empirical, is that, especially in this moment, adding in all of the other factors that are overlaid, a rigid two-party system is a dangerous accelerant towards democratic decline. And many of the reasons why were touched upon earlier, happy to answer them in questions, but skip over them for now. And so it brings us to then, okay, if that's true, if we accept that premise, why should we give fusion a close look? And so I think one of the things that's quite appealing about fusion, building upon the fact that it's bringing us back into our own history. We're not trying to create something in a lab and introduce it into the American system. It's really a reintroduction of something that had been inherent in our own history. Is that it really makes possible what's latent in the electorate. It makes it possible for people who want to organize and who want to create and claim their own political power to do so in an effective way. Derek is exactly right. There's nothing prescribed about this system ensuring certain outcomes. But I don't think, both the science and casual observation makes clear that people are deeply dissatisfied with the system, and there's a lot of energy to do something better. And Fusion makes that easier. I also think Dan's comments in the last panel about factionalism, I tend to agree with virtually everything he was saying, and I view Fusion and factions to be much more similar than they are different. I think that there's a lot of overlap in how small parties can function as effective partners with big parties in a way that looks just like some institutional dressing on factions that operate within a big party. And I think it's a good thing. I think there can be real play in the joints there. One other point that I'd touch upon before transitioning to the state courts is I think we see, especially in the presidential level, but also at the state level too, we're at a constant risk of a pro-democracy majority fracturing at the ballot box. Setting aside kind of moral views on whether a vote cast for a party, a candidate who isn't competitive is wasted or not. Setting aside that's immaterial, but the reality is that we know we have a majority of the electorate who's committed to a democratic system, but we're constantly at risk of that not translating into victories for pro-democratic candidates. And I mean that in the small sense, not the big D democratic, to be clear. Fusion does not require collaboration. It doesn't force people into unhappy marriages, but it makes collaboration possible. And it makes it easier for people who have different views to work together in a constructive way to rally together and defeat candidates who have avowedly authoritarian impulses. Again, as Derek pointed out, there's nothing inevitable about that, but it makes that sort of facilitation and collaboration easier. And that's something we should welcome. Pivoting to state court litigation, disclaimer, I am counsel of record in a case in New Jersey that is pending on this issue and a case in Kansas. So speaking with that hat on, I have a lot of intimacy and certainly strong views on how those cases work. The reason why we're talking about state courts here, as Derek explained earlier, is that the question as to whether banning fusion is something that states can do is now settled as a federal constitutional matter. However, every state has their own constitution, and state constitutions vary widely. Many kind of track closely, or some, let me say, track closely the protections provided by the federal constitution. But many, including Wisconsin's, have entirely different and in many cases very robust protections that just have no analog whatsoever in the federal context. And state constitutions are often ratified in environments that provide really critical meaning for understanding what those state constitutions provide. What did political participation mean at the time this constitution was ratified? And we need to live in that history and that context, understand what those protections mean today. And so the reason that fusion is legal in New York is because of a lawsuit brought over 100 years ago under the state constitution that said it's unlawful, it impermissibly limits our political rights under the state constitution to say we as a small party can't nominate the same person as this major party nominated. And the state court approved that argument and said absolutely, and has time and again throughout the 20th century reaffirmed the wisdom of that decision. California, actually at the same time as well, reached a similar decision that was then subsequently overturned by a voter initiative that amended the Constitution. So going back well over 100 years, we have cases in which courts have said, yes, our state constitutions affirm this right. Fast forward to modern day, there was a decision several years ago in Pennsylvania in which similar arguments were raised there. By one vote, the state Supreme Court turned down that argument. I think reading the decision, it's quite clear that the dissent has the more persuasive of the arguments, but didn't carry the day. And we are now awaiting decisions in several other cases around the country, again, mentioned in New Jersey and in Kansas, places where we think that the history and the constitutional text make quite clear that the state bans that were passed under similar context to here in Wisconsin, where it was nakedly obvious that the state parties were trying to limit participation, limit expression and competition, that those bans we think are quite vulnerable. All right, done time.
We're done.
Well, I'll be done then. Happy to answer questions. Thank you so much.
All right, we're going to start by me asking each of the panelists one unfair question for them to respond to, and then I promise we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So, Ali, you talked about the ban on fusion. There's a mic by my feet. The ban on fusion in Wisconsin in 1897. After that point, there were some flourishing third-party movements in the state. The progressives sort of had their heyday in the 10s and 20s under the La Follettes. Is that a sign that actually the end of fusion didn't squelch those kinds of movements, or is there something else happening there that's maybe separate from fusion? If you want to just take a couple, less than our initial 5 minutes, just a couple minutes from each panelist.
Yeah, we looked into that, and we found that it may be due to the fact that the ban was sort of under the rug, that it didn't spread as quickly as people thought, and you couldn't have you couldn't have the names on the ballots, but Wisconsin history has shown that fusion their definition of fusion did not necessarily need to have names on the ballots. And so that's a great question. And we've explored that, but we found that to actually fuse, to have electoral nomination fusions, that didn't occur after the ban.
Right. There's a kind of informality in this period, as Andy was saying, that doesn't exist today with a structured state ballot and those kinds of things. Andy, question for you. One thing that's not really come up here is the role of primaries in all of this. And you have the strong feelings about the free speech aspect of all this. Can you say something about how the primary reforms maybe we've seen around the country? There are proposals for top 4 and top 5. California and Washington are using top 2s. There are a whole variety of things that might be done there. How does that feed into the discussion of fusion?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is speaking of fighting Bob La Follette and the progressives. This is going to be heresy here, but primaries are terrible. Political parties are private organizations and ideally should be treated as such. But that ship has sailed a long time ago. There's nothing about fusion that makes it impractical for to have primaries like we're used to. One thing that's worth noting is that, so this is not the case in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, every ballot qualified party nominates by primary, even though the minor parties are usually, uncontested, but they have to get somebody on the primary ballot. This libertarian. Right? In a lot of states, you have a major minor party distinction, and the thinking behind that is these smaller parties are allowed to nominate by convention. So you don't have to go through all the rigmarole of having a primary election that's, administered and there's, 500 votes cast or something. So that's something to keep in mind on kind of the implementation side of that makes it a little bit easier for these smaller parties to do it because they're subject to less of the ballot access hurdles to run in their primaries and all the rest of it. But you absolutely can have both fusion and primaries. I mean, the history in California that was mentioned earlier of Earl Warren, that was a time when California had primaries, and he won both major party primaries.
Yeah. Derek, unfair question for you is about if fusion were allowed again in this state, or the way we've seen it in other states where it happens, are the parties that crop up to do this cross nomination likely to be sort of between the two major parties, like moderate or complicated versions of those positions, or are they likely to be on the wings? Maybe you can't predict that, but do you think the major parties respond in different ways to those different kinds of challenges, given what we know about third parties of that type, but under fusion, whether that works differently or the same?
Even worse, you're asking the political science question of the lawyer, but...
Well, the lawyers ask legal questions of me, so...
Well, I mean, I think I do know that the political parties could have different responses, right? I think in New York there is this there is a relationship, right, between those fusion parties and the major parties, and thinking about, well, how do we sort of work together in a wide range of cases? So if we're coming up with presidential electors and a slate of presidential electors, perhaps the Republicans will say, well, the conservatives can take a couple of electors on our side. So might be some working relationship between those two parties in terms of the fact that the Republicans and Democrats have different ideological views. Those parties at sort of the more extreme right and left positions want to hold them accountable to those views, and there might be some sort of agreement or dialogue. I don't know how that works with new parties as opposed to ones that have been around for 100 years, right? Do you think that the new kids on the block are going to be more antagonistic, in which case you are going to be less likely to work with them? Or are you going to realize this is another opportunity to harness a group of voters who might be disaffected and might be more interested in what this additional party is saying, and then we're going to figure out how to work with them? So I don't know what that looks like, if it's at the sort of edges. On the flip side, what does it look like for a moderate party? That becomes a very different dynamic, because now you have potentially, rather than working with kind of a wing of your party, like I'm working with the Tea Party as the Republicans, or I'm working with the Socialists as the Democrats, am I trying to figure out a group that might be working for literally the side with a party on the other side of the aisle with certain candidates? I don't know what that dynamic would necessarily look like. My sense is it's going to be much harder for the parties to view this as sort of a working partner if they think that half of the candidates might be somebody who's going to be or nominated by the other side, the other party. I'm not sure what that dynamic might look like, except that maybe there will be an effort to try to capture the party and say, well, we're the 75% reasonable party. Let's figure out what that looks like. And then there is the incentive to try to appear as centrist and attractive as possible and sort of embrace it. And those are the sort of working embracing models. But again, at the same time, as I indicated, you might see sort of purity pledges. You might see requirements that say, if you've been listed on the ballot with any other party in the last 4 years, you cannot appear on our party line in the future. In the same way that a lot of states have rules, the Republicans and Democrats will say, if you voted in another party's primary in the last 4 years, or if you've been registered with another political party in the last 4 years, you cannot be a candidate for our party on the ballot.
Right.
Could I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to build on that, I think in some sense, it's not a hypothetical question in Wisconsin. Like, there's a new party that's been formed and people are trying to do this right now, right? That's not to say that there wouldn't be additional energy and effort as well. We also can look at, there's real interest, real organizing attention, resources. People are trying to do this, and it's state law that's preventing them from being able to actually go forward and be an equal part of the political process. So I'm not going to speak on behalf of the United Wisconsin Party, but I encourage folks. I believe that some of the folks from that effort are here, and so I'd encourage people to talk to them, to learn what it is they're trying to do. And I think that is, one that's not going to tell the full picture, but that's something that's not hypothetical. It's very real, and it's very much happening here now.
Yes, this is a segue to my question for you. You mentioned 4 states. You mentioned Connecticut and New York, where fusion is practiced, the disaggregated form that I think we have in mind. You mentioned the lawsuits in New Jersey and Kansas. You didn't mention Wisconsin, where there's a lawsuit underway. And it strikes me that Wisconsin is different from those other 4, that we are a very competitive battleground state. And so I wonder if you've thought about how fusion might work differently in that environment. Will small margins make a big difference? And where the world is watching our state in presidential years to see how the Electoral College is likely to come out, that's going to put a spotlight probably on fusion in a way it's not in Connecticut and New York, where it's less consequential for outcomes.
They're going to play in crucial Waukesha County.
Yeah, the Waukesha County question.
No, it's a great question. And I think all of the efforts that have arisen and, the lawsuits that we're involved in Kansas and New Jersey, there's real local interest. People at the grassroots wanted to be able to influence races in their states, even if it wasn't at the presidential level, wasn't always necessarily at the statewide level, but they really care about all of the other competitive races that are up and down the ballot. And so I think from the perspective of people who have the lived experience, who are on the ground, who want their state politics to be different, to be better, to be more responsive, to be less extreme, whatever it is their priorities are, I think it's no different across jurisdictions. What it means to some of Derek's observations, if fusion's lawful in Wisconsin, how do the DNC and RNC react, right? How do the presidential campaigns react? I think those are really good and difficult questions, and hard to fully speculate that out. I think that, again, just my organization's nonpartisan. I'm not speaking on their behalf, but taking the United Wisconsin's platform at face value, the sort of things that they're articulating, winning that ballot line for a candidate in any statewide office, I think would presumably be something that could be highly sought after, and could help elevate the sort of issues that organization and that faction of the electorate wants to see. And And so I think that strikes me as something that's valuable and at least worth serious consideration.
All right, let me give the panelists a chance to ask each other questions, or if you have comments on one another's comments. We did that in the previous panel. I thought it was a really helpful conversation. So open it up to the four of you to raise anything about one another. Not anything about one another, but about your comments that were made here.
Well, I guess, Derek, I'm curious for your thoughts on why state courts should or shouldn't be persuaded by the way the federal courts have resolved these questions. Do you think that's like a useful guide, or if they should be kind of charting their own path?
Yeah, I mean, I think state courts definitely should chart their own path. I think the United States Constitution says fairly little about a right to vote. I think this is famously discussed in the legal literature. There's very little about the right to vote. So the things that are discussed, as Andy pointed out, it's often couched as a First Amendment right or an expressive right, or sometimes it's an equal protection right. And so you're kind of cobbling together additional values. We're using this relationship with the voting. I know Dean Takagi somewhere here about voting as association is an article he's written, and how the courts have viewed this as an associational right because they already have a First Amendment right of association that they can then sort of glom onto the right to vote. That's very different than the state constitutions, which have, with varying degrees of specificity or detail, the right to vote, the opportunity to cast a ballot, or what the right to voters to be able to do looks like. And that is enacted in a moment against the backdrop of law and against the backdrop of understanding of what it means for voters to, for instance, exercise their choice of a preferred candidate. And so with that backdrop, and again, it's going to look a little bit different from state to state, depending on the time that you adopt it, and maybe your views of the common law or general law might differ and affect these things. But I think you have many more robust opportunities to think about how state constitutions do this with their express provisions about the right to vote and the centrality that states have in administering elections than you would with sort of that federal framework. And I think it's a reason, absolutely to reject sort of the federal framework in these cases.
Other comments or questions from panelists to one another?
I'd be able to add one coda to your question before, and something was illustrated by Dave Palmer's slide at the beginning. I think, looking at the realm, I think one of the ills that many of us, the trouble many of us hear is we're seeing this happen with all of the redistricting wars, the number of districts that are truly competitive. How many races are seen as safe for one party or another? And I think that there's, no consensus, many of us view that as really troubling, and that we'd be better off with more competitive races, and that could have some positive downstream effects for how governance works. I think that there's strong reason to believe that having more flexibility that a system like this would provide could expand the number of seats that are competitive. When you have the ability for even a few additional percentage points of the electorate to potentially be willing to move their vote one side to the other, or you reduce the likelihood of votes cast for a third candidate who isn't going to be competitive, you can probably meaningfully expand the number of seats in which it's not a foreordained conclusion who is going to win, and that's valuable.
So I wanted to your point about whether or not there would be centrist fusion parties, moderate fusion parties. I mean, we do have some examples of that. Dan will get mad at me for calling this fusion because it's actually dual labeling. It's not aggregated. But Oregon does have an independent party that's a moderate, does some Republicans, some Democrats. There's some cases out of Long Island where moderate Democrats had a moderate ballot line, and that actually helped put them over the top. So there are some of that, but it is true. Most of what we see, like in New York, is like the Working Families Party is the big model we all kind of have in mind. But I think it's important, like, that can be a positive sum game, even if your concern is moderation and polarization, to have these left or right flank parties. They can then productively prioritize their issues. So the Working Families Party, just to use them as an example, they run on state level policy things. They run on things like the minimum wage or public financing, and they are able to do that, and they concentrate that activist energy there. And you also have a very moderate Democratic Party in New York, relatively. And so I think it's important to, it's exactly that. We're not trying to like bake in, bland centrism as the automatic outcome. And that's never the right way to think about it. But I think you can have that kind of, because you can have the left and right parties engage more productively. you can also end up with less polarized major parties.
As a question of Ali and Andy, I think you described the history accurately. I think one of my lingering questions is thinking about the election administration piece of this, which is between 1830 and 1880, if you wanted your candidate to run, you had to run your own separate election as an organization, right? You were printing tickets, you were handing them out to voters. If you couldn't get them into the hands of voters, they weren't going to vote for your candidate. So it was an extraordinary effort for these third parties or future parties, however you want to label them, to get their tickets into the hands of voters. When you get to the arrival of the Australian ballot in 1888, states realized originally it's something, states like Massachusetts, if you got 10 voters to sign, your name would appear on the ballot. And very quickly they realized, well, maybe it's too easy to get on the ballot, because now at a very low cost, your name is now in everyone's hand in the entire state on a consistent statewide basis. So I know there are mechanisms and checks in place that we have to make sure that they're serious parties or not serious parties, or how we sort of make that distinction. But I just wonder if you could think about that administration piece in the shift of how the parties would have to organize in the mid-19th century versus how they have to organize today.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that we certainly asked when we were doing research. And the archives in Wisconsin, our dream archive was to find all of these old ballots that showed everything, but that didn't happen because of the sort of administration work. However, we relied heavily on newspapers, and obviously there were partisan newspapers, but we relied heavily on their narrative. And we looked for any kind of confusion. We looked for any kinds of signal that, this process of finding these candidates and supporting these candidates, we looked for anything that would say that these voters were confused or the administration was confusing to handle. And we didn't find anything in those newspapers that suggested that voters or the readers of these newspapers were confused about how admin was handling this. And with the Australian ballot, a lot of newspapers widely supported the Australian ballot. You had, especially in Wisconsin, you had bosses who were watching over you while you voted. Of course, people, say the Knights of Labor, the Labor parties are going to want that. But as, we looked into it, and as the evidence suggests, is that, the Australian ballot, the administration, while it fixed that solution, it did not foreclose banning fusion. That wasn't an inevitable process.
So on the point of it being too easy, so you often will hear it said that Lincoln wasn't on the ballot in the South in 1860. Of course, that's anachronistic. There just weren't Republicans in the South to organize and do all that. They put up their elector slate and print their party tickets and everything. So this kind of goes to the what is the justification for ballot access barriers, and there's tons of litigation about this always going on every cycle with all the minor parties. So every state has usually it's either petition requirements or a filing fee, a deposit, and these are very effective methods to require just a kind of de minimis amount of skin in the game, and it doesn't take much. You don't have to make it very hard so that you don't get 20 or 30 parties. We have these, like here in Wisconsin, if you want to run for state rep, it's a couple hundred signatures. And you almost never see more than 3 or 4 candidates on the ballot. So it's justified to do that, but it's kind of a least restrictive means analysis. Like, yeah, we don't want to have 80 joke candidates spamming the ballot, but you don't have to make it very hard to get where you don't have that problem. And compared to other major democracies, American ballot access laws, worse in some states than others, but they're very, very burdensome. If you're talking about running a third-party presidential candidate, you're needing 1 million signatures nationwide to get on the ballot nationwide in all 50 states. So generally, we have the opposite problem. Like states, for similar reasons to why they ban fusion, often really want to make it hard. They don't want spoilers, which is not a constitutionally legitimate reason, but that's the real political motive. But I think you really do solve this problem. Make somebody put $1,000 deposit down, make them get a few hundred signatures. That gets rid of the jokers.
If I can respond,
Yep.
like the organizing part of what you said, Derek. I want to put on your fellow ELB host Tabitha Abu-Elhaj. She were here, she would say, we need our parties to be actually out there hustling. We need our parties to be real associations. And that sort of work, that the effort to go into communities and to go and connect with people and to be more than just like a PR firm, which is in a lot of ways what like the parties function as now, is fundraising and PR. That's like what parties like the Working Families Party and some of these other minor parties who use Fusion have done. They've demonstrated like this is how they build a base of support. And so no, not going around and having to put ballots in everyone's hands, but like we'd actually be better off if we had incentives and systems, I think, that pushed parties to be doing more of that work, get closer to people, and to bring people into the system.
Okay, we're going to go to audience questions. We're going to do things slightly differently than in the first panel. You raise your hand, I'll call on you. A mic will come your way. Marisa will come your way with a mic in her hand. Tell us who you are, if you could just introduce yourself and then ask your question into the mic. So, Marisa, you're out there. Why don't we start all the way in the back?
Thank you. Beverly Spear. I'm with the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Pleasure to be here. I haven't heard any discussion about money in politics. I know someone brought up the initial question earlier, but there would have to be some complementary reform in terms of how money flows into these elections. And I just haven't heard enough of that discussion today. Thanks.
Who wants to address that?
It's a hard question.
Well, yeah, I think
that's why it was skirted in the first panel.
I think the First Amendment in jurisprudence is interpreted by the Supreme Court makes that much harder, right? Supreme Court has made it very clear, and there's, I think, a pretty clear majority of the Supreme Court, and it's going to last indefinitely and probably only going to broaden, which suggests that there is a right to essentially spend as much money as you would like as a candidate, to be able to spend as much you would like as you are raising money and spending it independent of candidates. And you are restricted in terms of the amount of money that can be contributed to candidates. So for political parties, if you're a new political party, you're limited in the amount of money that can come in, but there's unlimited expenditures that you could have. If you are a new political party, again, I don't know which way it cuts. If you want to try to constrict what the major political parties are doing, you're not going to be able to do that. If you want to loosen the contribution limits to be able to make it easier for a new political party to grow, you're going to do that in the same way that's going to allow the major political parties to likewise get that amount of money. So I think there's a lot of money. It's very difficult to include any kinds of additional restrictions on campaign finance in the indefinite future, would be my thought about it. How that necessarily interacts with thinking about fusion is maybe a more complicated matter for me.
Yeah, that came up this morning too. There's also the question at the presidential level. Imagine a world where fusion existed in all the states and there were small parties running and some of them met the 5% threshold. They might receive FEC public funding, which now the major parties are declining. So that law is sitting there to be potentially used.
I mean, it's $20 million, which is great for a party.
Yes.
But in places where the campaigns are billions of dollars now, it's
It's a few ads in California.
like a lot 20 years ago.
That's right.
Just one quick note on campaign finance is the contribution limits and the individual donation limits for parties have really contributed to the kind of backfiring party weakening. That's why the money flows into super PACs and independent expenditures, because with this good reform motive, we came in and capped how much anybody can give to a party. So if you're a generous benefactor who wants to put in money to, start a new third party, moderate, left wing, right wing, whatever, those are constrained in ways that are kind of a product of the existing system. So, all of what we could do about campaign finance is a whole other discussion, to be sure. I don't think it directly affects how Fusion works or anything. But it does fit into that broad political science, not quite consensus, but pretty close to consensus, that we need party strengthening reforms, and that a lot of what we've done, including my dig at fighting Bob over primaries, have been party weakening. So that's just one thing to keep in mind.
Other questions? How about here? Lisa, wait for the mic to introduce and then
Hi,
question.
I'm Lisa Dish. So I just want to add a little bit to Allie's response to your unfair question. I'll make this very quick because it's an answer rather than a question. There are the bans on fusion were absolutely consequential for the kinds of third parties that Bo talked about, bringing out what is latent in the electorate. They closed off the possibility for parties to bubble up, organized by people who nobody knew. La Follette was a splinter party out of the Republican Party. He had a long and very visible career as a Republican before he ran as a progressive. And that is the only entryway right now almost the only, for a third political party to have big adherents. And so the fusion bans were absolutely consequential. And the thing that fusion served that Bo said is really important to bear in mind.
Okay, let's keep rolling through questions. You want to come to the far side here, Risa? Squeak through. Got to make it hard for her.
Hi, Rita Maniotis. I'm with the Wisconsin Green Party. Andy Craig touched on how the two parties have colluded. Well, you didn't say that, but anyway, colluded to limit ballot access in a lot of states by raising the signature requirements. It's wonderful in Wisconsin. You can actually get people on the ballot. But how can small parties trust that fusion voting isn't just a way to circumvent and steal other ballot lines? Like, for instance, if we have to go through a primary process, major parties can put their candidate through the primary and primary out the smaller party's primary candidate to steal the ballot line. How can we trust that that's not going to happen?
Yeah, no, that goes to the point I mentioned about allowing minor parties to nominate by convention or their internal processes. That's going to depend in large part on what the state's laws are governing primaries. Can the party block a candidate, like Derek mentioned, is a possibility in some states, not others, where, if you're the Green Party and let's say Tammy Baldwin comes in and wants to run in the Green primary and y'all don't want her to, do you have the legal option to block her? That's what that's going to hinge on. But I think it also encourages. Yeah, I also came from a third party. I was in the Libertarian Party here in Wisconsin many moons ago. Even that threat encourages, I think, these smaller parties to do something they're not always the greatest at, which is do their own internal organizing. Like, if you have a candidate on your primary ballot that y'all don't want, you need to go out there and reach your voters and actually organize and, have your guy in the race instead who can beat him. And granted, I get your concern that a major party candidate has big high name ID and all the rest of it. But even in states like Wisconsin that have very rarely contested third party primaries, a statewide race will have a couple thousand votes in a Libertarian or Green primary for, governor or Senate or something like that. So, not to be too harsh on it, but if you can't, if you're a political party that can't rally 1,000 of your own voters in your own primary, you might need to go back to the drawing board.
Others want to comment on the kind of the wariness of minor parties thinking about fusion?
Everything Andy said makes sense. And that, I think, as a general rule, I think can be a misconception that in this system where fusion is permitted, it's required. And that's just certainly not true, right? The Green Party in New York chooses to almost exclusively run its own candidates. I believe Libertarian Party in New York chooses to almost exclusively run its own candidates. That's their prerogative, right? I think that you ask people in Albany who has more power, is the Conservative Party and the Working Families Party or the Green Party and the Libertarians? It's a pretty clear answer. But that's what's key to the political freedoms we're talking about here. Folks should be able to engage in the political process in the way they want to. And it's about whether the state can censor them from doing something that they ought to be able to do.
Questions? Can we catch this question here?
Yes,
my question is, my name is Harry Reese. Thank you all so much for your contribution so far. My question is sort of historical in nature, and I'm curious about whether there was any national connection between the phenomena of banning fusion voting in Wisconsin, and then the sort of violent post-Reconstruction efforts to disenfranchise Black Republicans in the former Confederacy. How those dynamics were or weren't influencing each other, was this mainly a local story?
Well, you can probably speak to Wisconsin better, but in general, this was a very state by state thing. There was never a big, in part because it's state by state whose ox is getting gored. Like there was never a big Republican national RNC led campaign to ban fusion, or on the Democratic side. It was very much the state and local level political context, and that relates to another point about fusion that hasn't been brought up as much, but I think is really important, is that fusion parties tend to be more state and local parties. You've got the Progressive Party in Vermont, which again is dual labeling, not disaggregated, but still. They have a very state level focus. The Working Families Party has very state level focus, and so that can have benefits, but that's also what really brought out the attacks that got banned was state and local level political.
It wasn't the case that in some states it was Republicans who pushed for the ban, and in other states it was Democrats who pushed for the ban, depending on who felt most threatened.
Yeah, and I mean, I can speak with Wisconsin history that it was absolutely the Republican Party that felt threatened in the Wisconsin context. And I'm glad you brought up the case about the Democratic Party, because it was the party who felt the most threatened. And in Wisconsin, you had major wins in 1894 and 1896. So once the Republicans regained their power, they banned fusion. And, in the Wisconsin context, too, it was much stealthier than perhaps other states. It was kind of snuck in into a larger election reform bill. And so newspapers were kind of shocked that this happened without having any discussion. And so it was a stealthy way of Republicans to regain power. And then after the ban in 1897, I mean, Republicans controlled the next 40 years in Wisconsin legislature.
I would just add, you had, that's exactly right. And then you had late 1890s to about 1920, both Democrat and Republican states, something like 35-ish states in that span banned it. So there was not a conspiracy. It wasn't a national campaign, but it was all on as the Australian ballot was being introduced everywhere, and on the tail end of a lot of very successful fusion efforts in the 1890s, populist agrarians, all of these movements inspired the sort of backlash we saw in Wisconsin. So it was disconnected, but happening in parallel.
I come here.
Cindy Carter with our Wisconsin Revolution. How would fusion voting work with the Fair Map situation? Fair maps. How would fair maps be affected by fusion?
For the non-Wisconsin people, we have a long-running saga in our state around redistricting. There's a Fair Maps Coalition. There have been some lawsuits that have changed maps in the state legislature. There are currently some cases that might change the congressional districts. So your question is, does the changing of the districts interact with fusion in any way, or the perceived unfairness of districts affect fusion in any way?
I mean, my sense is I haven't seen a lot of that in New York. I could be wrong. But I mean, if it hasn't played out a lot and New York had very public redistricting battles this most recent cycle, so maybe it won't have much of an effect.
I would just, as an administrative matter, it doesn't directly, the district could be whatever the district is. Fusion doesn't affect that. But if you have a big campaign like that, and there's similar ones in Utah underway and whatever, you could have Fair Maps as your fusion ticket. You can have a single issue fusion party. So you could go out there and campaign in districts and maybe make some districts a little bit more competitive than they'd otherwise be. Because, we know where public opinion is on that. People hate gerrymandering. So that would be my suggestion if hopefully we win the lawsuit is go, there's your carrot and stick to encourage people. Fair Maps would be a great ballot line to label.
That's, one of the things these smaller parties can do is raise issues the bigger parties are not comfortable with. Question here.
Thanks. Yeah, I've got two very brief questions. The first is fusion what accounts or has accounted for the longevity of the Conservative Party within New York State? My second question is, would you say that fusion, or more accurately, the lack thereof, is what accounted for the very short-lived existence of the U.S. Labor Party? I ask that because I was at the founding convention of the Labor Party. One of the workshops there placed a lot of hope, tying the existence of fusion to the future of that party. Thank you.
I don't know if I have answers that are specific to those two. I think as a generalizable observation, it's really hard under a rigid two-party system where fusion is banned for a minor party that is electorally relevant to persist over time. I just think that like all of the incentives swim against it, and you can have some parties that persist because you're a very small number of dedicated people who feel strongly about continuing to work together. But I think it's really challenging. So I don't know I can't speak to those exact examples, but wouldn't surprise me if it was at least a substantial factor.
One point about the history in New York, real briefly, is there has been the Conservative Party running for a long time. William F. Buckley ran for mayor as the Conservative candidate. Though on the left side of the aisle, there was also for a long time the Liberal Party, and it was kind of the counterpart. It went into decline. It cross-nominated Rudy Giuliani, which did not go over well with a lot of people, so it kind of collapsed. But it was supplanted by the Working Families Party, which is far and away the more successful. I mean, the conservatives are there and have their influence, but the Working Families Party is really the left flank fusion party that's got the most influence in New York. So that's kind of that creative destruction, so to speak.
It's responsive to what people want, right? It allows people to use change, priorities change, new leaders emerge, and it allows for more fluidity in a way that seems healthy.
All right, question here, Marisa, if you wouldn't mind. Going to get your steps in today.
Thank you so much. My name is Ron Luskin. I've been involved 1970 working with newspapers. And I guess we know that we've been successful here for 200 years dealing with newspapers. But what's going to be successful for us in the future now and such? Obviously, the newspapers are going away. And I think it's really significant about local and state newspapers. So if you could speak about that for a few minutes, I'd appreciate that.
And is the question about the connection of declining newspapers to awareness of fusion or voter education about fusion? What's the fusion connection there?
Well, how newspapers are going to be effective, in what we're doing.
I've got a newspaper
connection.
Yeah. So I've actually got a bunch of these on my wall at home because they're neat to collect. But like I mentioned, the party ticket ballots were all newspapers. So, and that related to the healthy in a way. We had newspapers we still have like the Democrat Gazette in Arkansas. You see these legacy names sometimes that reflect that history of overtly partisan newspapers, which we think of as not being what we want objective, whatever. But that feedback loop, even though we're not going to go back to, cut out your ballot like you would a coupon to go to the grocery store. But that actually was a kind of healthy connection between the parties and the newspapers that the older parties' ticket system did allow to function. And I think under fusion, even though we wouldn't be going back to party ticket, it encourages that because it creates that, and it goes to the same thing about parties organizing and creating the incentive for parties to organize. That includes an incentive for the parties to create their own media ecosystems where they can reach their voters. And that might not necessarily be legacy newspapers, and we've got the internet and social media and everything, but it's helpful and fruitful. It's let 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of having all these reinforcing incentives to have healthy political parties and a healthier media ecosystem.
We can do another question or two before we break for lunch, and I'll give you some instructions about that. I see a question here down the aisle.
Hello, my name's Sid Warren. I'm with the Daily Cardinal at UW-Madison. I was wondering if you view fusion voting as the final goal of voter reform, or if you think more steps are needed.
No, it'll fix everything. I mean, that's the talking, but I mean, no, it's certainly, there's lots of other things. I mean, I know Bo and Protect Democracy also work on proportional representation. There's people that work on ranked choice. There's people that work on campaign finance. I mean, there's no silver bullet, but it is, one of the good things about our federal system is the states can be very literally, in this sense, laboratories of democracy. So, if in 20 years we win all this and people decide, oh, fusion's garbage, nothing's set in stone. But I don't think that's what would happen.
Yeah, I would just add that it is somewhat unique insofar as it's looking to restore a practice that had been ubiquitous, as opposed to introducing something new. And not to say that new things are bad, but that it does have a historical gloss that puts it in somewhat of its own category. But to be crystal clear, like, that is not, there's no single thing. There is a lot of hard work is needed. My organization works on dozens of different issues around minimizing, executive abuse of power and the rule of law. And we really need to be working on all dimensions to get back to a more responsive, healthy democracy. We view this as one notable idea to be pushing forward, but alongside many others.
Okay, let's do one final question.
Thanks so much. Nate Atkinson, UW Law School. My question is, how do we disentangle the 19th century context, the Australian ballot versus fusion? As you've mentioned, there's these party tickets. What you haven't mentioned is that they're all colored, and everyone knows how everyone is voting. We have 80-90% turnout in elections because parties can deliver votes, and there's very transactional, very patronage-based politics. And so when we see these coalitions forming, how can we think about whether that is because of fusion or because my boss is over there and knows how I voted, right? Or there are enforcers at the ballot boxes, right, who intimidate you. Election violence is regular in the 19th century. So how do we disentangle kind of the fusion aspect from that, from the observability of the votes?
That's right. It's resuscitating an old practice, but into a new environment. So maybe, Bo, if you want to speak to that.
Just quickly say, there were hundreds of fusion elections, even outside of New York and Connecticut, that happened after the introduction of the Australian ballot. So this wasn't exclusively a party ticket system. This was happening frequently and throughout the country in the 1890s and early 20th century. Once the Australian ballot was introduced, the fusion bans didn't always happen at the same time. Often it would be years later. And we see it continuing in, again, New York and Connecticut through modernity. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from taking into heart everything you were to say.
And that's the same context for Wisconsin as well. Australian ballot was 1887. Fusion still worked well, especially in the 1894 and 1896 elections. And then there was the ban.
Yeah. I would just add that the history of how we got to the party ticket system was actually a step towards the secret ballot. That was the reform goal they had in mind in the early 19th century, the late 18th century. Because before that, it was like Iowa caucus style. Where you had to stand up in front of all your neighbors and announce who you're voting for. So, yeah. Secret ballots, that's my hot take, is you should be able to cast a secret ballot.
I mean,
controversial.
I think it's sometimes hard to disaggregate a lot of the things that are happening on these Australian ballot. Before that, you could see the color, and that meant you didn't have to be literate to vote. And once you switch to a state printed ballot, you had to have literacy to be able to vote, unless you have something like party cues, like symbols on the ballot or things like that. So there's huge complications with every reform, has different mechanisms to think about, what was descriptively happening and what was the normative aspirational goal that we want to have here. I mean, I think it's a super interesting one to think about the turnout aspect. Civil service reform, I'm sure, is a part of it. Bosses being there is probably a part of it, right? There's lots of different ways to think about it. But yeah, I think it's to highlight the history's messy in this area.
Yeah. Let's thank our panel for a terrific discussion.